Lake Powell just hit 22%. America's second biggest reservoir, the one keeping 40 million people alive across 7 states, is in a death spiral. And what is happening right now inside Glen Canyon Dam is not just a water shortage. It is the slow-motion collapse of a 100-year-old promise that was mathematically impossible from the very first day it was made. Picture a 710-foot wall of concrete holding back everything: the water, the electricity, the farms, the cities. Now picture that wall becoming completely useless. Not because it cracked, not because of a flood or an earthquake, but because the water behind it is simply disappearing. And there is no emergency button, no backup plan, no rescue coming. Here's the part that should terrify you. The people running this system have known this was coming for decades. They just never told you. So how much time is left before the dam that built the American West finally, completely stops working? Stand at the edge of Lake Powell today and look up. The canyon walls above the waterline are marked with thick white rings. Calcium carbonate burned into the red sandstone like the rings of a dying tree. But these rings do not measure growth. They measure loss. Each band marks a year the Colorado River could not deliver what it promised. Each one is a broken agreement turned into stone. The rings from the 1980s hang dozens of feet above the rings from the year 2000. The rings from 2010 sit above those from 2020. And the lowest ring, carved just last year, hovers barely above what little water remains. The distance between the highest band and the lowest one is not just geology. It is the physical record of a century-long system running out of time. In April 2023, Lake Powell hit an all-time low of elevation, 3,519 feet. That number shattered the previous record by 50 vertical feet, a drop equal to an entire 5-story building swallowed beneath the surface in a single month. Today, the lake sits at just 22% of its total capacity. Put that in terms that actually hit. Lake Powell was designed to hold 26 million acre-feet of water. That is enough to flood the entire state of Texas to a depth of 6 feet, above a 2-story building. That is what this reservoir was built to contain. Right now, more than 3/4 of it is already gone. Here is the number that is keeping engineers awake at night. Elevation 3,370 feet. Draw a line on the canyon wall roughly 100 feet below where the water sits right now. That line has a name. They call it Deadpool. Not as a metaphor. That is the official term, and it means exactly what it sounds like. When the water drops below that line, it falls beneath the lowest intake tunnels built into the base of Glen Canyon Dam. No water can be pulled through those tunnels. The turbines go silent. The 1,320 megawatts of electricity powering millions of homes across the Southwest cuts out completely. And the controlled water releases that 7 states and Mexico depend on to survive simply stop. This is not a mechanical failure. No pipe will burst. No wall will crack. The dam will stand exactly as it was engineered to stand. It will simply become useless. A 710-foot monument to a system that finally ran out of the one thing it was built to manage. The bathtub rings keep accumulating on the canyon walls. The water level keeps dropping. And that line at elevation 3,370 feet keeps getting closer every single day. This is no longer a warning. This is a countdown. Go back to 1922. Go back more than 100 years to a world so different from today, it might as well be a different planet. The Colorado River carved through red rock canyons and swept across the desert in a torrent that seemed like it would never stop. It fed the growing cities of Arizona and California. It watered the dust. It promised abundance to anyone willing to claim it. And in November of that year, the leaders of 7 states gathered in a building in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to divide that river as if they were splitting an inheritance that would never run dry. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California. They sat down at a table and drew lines on water. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 gave the upper basin states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year. The lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, and California, received another 7.5 million acre-feet per year. On top of that, a separate treaty guaranteed Mexico 1.5 million acre-feet annually. The total promised to the river every single year, forever, 16 million acre-feet. Amen. Here is where the story turns darker than anyone sitting at that table wanted to admit. The men who drew up those numbers were not working with bad intentions. They were working with bad data. The Colorado River they were measuring during those negotiations was running unusually high, extraordinarily high. Scientists and geologists who have studied tree rings, sediment layers, and centuries of hydrological records now know the truth. Those negotiators were measuring the river during one of the wettest decades in 500 years. The Colorado River's actual average annual flow, the real number, measured not over decades but across centuries of geological and hydrological evidence, sits closer to 12.5 million acre-feet per year. Some estimates put it even lower. They promised 16 million. The river delivers 12.5. That is not a rounding error. That is not a bad year followed by a good one. That gap of nearly 3.5 million acre-feet, missing every single year without exception, is called the structural deficit, and it was locked into the agreement before a single shovel of dirt was turned. For decades, no one talked about it. The reservoirs stayed full, water kept flowing, cities kept growing, the desert kept blooming. Nobody counted the cost, because the cost was buried inside the one buffer they had built into the system. When that buffer disappears, the math becomes unavoidable. The Colorado River Compact did not fail recently. It was always going to fail. They just gave it a full 100 years to prove it. In 1963, Glen Canyon Dam was finished. A 710-foot wall of concrete and steel rising from the Red Canyon floor, as tall as a 70-story skyscraper, engineered to hold back one of the largest man-made lakes in the world. At its dedication ceremony, politicians gave speeches about unlimited growth and American greatness. Helicopters flew overhead. Cameras captured the moment. The message was clear. We had beaten the desert. We had engineered our way past scarcity forever. The dam was a genuine engineering marvel. It generated 1,320 megawatts of hydroelectric power, enough to keep roughly 1.3 million homes running air conditioning through the peak summer heat. That electricity flowed out through the Western Area Power Administration to Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Nebraska. Clean energy from a river that would never stop running. And the dam stored water. That was its other purpose, the one that mattered most. Wet years sent surplus flows pouring into Lake Powell, filling the reservoir behind the dam. Dry years released that stored water back into the system, honoring the promises of the 1922 Compact, even when the river itself could not. It was elegant engineering. A giant hydraulic savings account that bridged the gap between drought years and flood years. The problem was never the engineering. The engineers did exactly what they were asked to do. They built it precisely as specified, and it performed exactly as designed. The problem was the assumption buried inside the plan itself. The dam did not create new water, not a single drop. It redistributed water across time. It took water from the years that had extra and loaned it to the years that came up short. That only works if the account stays full. That only works if the wet years keep coming back and refilling what the dry years take out. For roughly 3 decades, the system held together. The lake filled. The promises were kept. Nobody looked too closely at the math because the math appeared to be working. The system seemed permanent. What they were really doing was spending down a finite account and calling it abundance. The safety net was not the dam. The safety net was the volume of water stored behind it. And that water was always going to run out if the river kept delivering less than the system kept promising to provide. The dam was never the solution to the structural deficit. It was the delay of it. A century-long delay, elegant and expensive, built from concrete and political optimism. Now the delay is over. The account is nearly empty. The math that was always lurking beneath the surface is finally showing its complete and unavoidable answer. In the year 2000, something changed in the American Southwest that nobody fully understood at the time. The Colorado River Basin did not just enter a drought. It crossed a threshold that climate scientists are only now beginning to fully quantify. The word drought implies something temporary, something that ends. A dry year, a difficult decade, and then the rains return and the river recovers and the lakes refill. What happened in 2000 was not that. Scientists now use a different word. Aridification, not a drought that will eventually break. A permanent shift to a drier climate baseline. A new normal that is not temporary and is not going to reverse itself. The Colorado River Basin has been getting measurably, verifiably drier for 23 consecutive years, and the data shows no sign of reversal. The scale of that drought is staggering. Researchers analyzing tree rings, sediment cores, and geological records have now confirmed that this is the worst sustained dry period in 1,200 years. Medieval times, before the invention of the printing press. Further back than that. This is a drought so severe and so prolonged that it falls entirely outside the boundaries of anything that human civilization in this region has ever experienced. The physical consequences were immediate and compounding. Temperatures across the Southwest climbed. The snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the primary source that feeds the Colorado River through spring runoff, began melting earlier in the season and producing less water overall. The river's entire hydraulic cycle changed, and the flow dropped, not by a little. The Colorado River's annual flow fell another 20% on top of a baseline that was already not enough to honor the promises of the 1922 Compact, and it did not recover. Year after year, decade after decade, the numbers kept getting worse. In 2024, the Colorado River Basin consumed 13.3 million acre-feet of water, while the actual river delivered only 11.9 million. That is a deficit of 1.4 million acre-feet in a single year. To put that in terms that land, that shortfall is equivalent to the entire annual water supply of Nevada and Arizona combined, simply erased from the system every 12 months. Peer-reviewed studies built on data from the National Center for Atmospheric Research project that Colorado River flows could decline another 10 to 35% by 2050. The Southwest is warming at nearly twice the global average rate. Higher temperatures pull more water out of the reservoirs through evaporation. More evaporation means less water. It is basic physics. It does not care about agreements, allocations, or legal frameworks. The system was designed to handle occasional dry years, not a permanent reorganization of regional climate. Nobody built it for this. Deadpool is no longer a term that engineers debate in conference rooms. It is no longer a threshold that exists only in planning documents and worst-case projections. It is a countdown timer. And based on the current trajectory, the question is no longer whether it happens, but how soon. At elevation 3,370 feet, the water level inside Lake Powell drops below the lowest intake tunnels feeding Glen Canyon Dam. When that happens, no water can be pulled through those tunnels to spin the turbines. The intakes are simply cut off. The 1,320 megawatts of hydroelectric power that supplies roughly 40% of the entire Southwest's renewable electricity goes completely silent. Cities that depend on that power face cascading blackouts. The grid destabilizes. Hospitals, water treatment plants, and cooling systems that millions of people depend on in 110-degree summer heat, begin operating on emergency backup power. But here is the truth that makes the power failure look small by comparison. Electricity, with enough investment and enough time, can come from somewhere else. Panels can be built, turbines can be installed, solar farms can be expanded, wind turbines can be erected, grids can be restructured. It takes years and costs billions, but electricity has alternatives. Water does not. Without active management through Glen Canyon Dam's gates, the controlled releases that the lower basin states have depended on for 7 decades stop. Not slow down. Stop. Arizona would lose the majority of its entire Colorado River allocation. Phoenix, Scottsdale, and Tucson, cities that collectively house more than 5 million people, were built in one of the most arid places on the continent entirely, on the promise that this river would keep delivering. That promise ends at elevation 3,370 feet. Nevada would lose water, not theoretically, not eventually, actually lose it. Las Vegas, a city of 2 million people, growing faster than almost anywhere else in America, built on the floor of the Mojave Desert, would face a water supply crisis with no parallel in its history and no quick solution waiting in reserve. California would lose water it has no realistic alternative for. The farms of the Central Valley, which produce roughly a quarter of the food supply for the entire United States, depend on controlled irrigation from the Colorado River system. Without that water, fields go dry, harvests disappear, food prices rise across the country, and Mexico, which depends on Colorado River flows for both drinking water and agriculture in the Mexicali Valley, loses everything it relies on downstream. The Colorado River Compact, the legal foundation on which the entire modern American West was constructed, would not just strain under pressure. It would completely, irreversibly, and finally fail. When is now looking like the more accurate word, not if. The emergency response began in 2021. That was the year the Bureau of Reclamation triggered Tier 1 shortage declarations for the first time in the history of the Colorado River Compact. Arizona lost water. Nevada lost water. Mexico lost water. The cuts were designed as a temporary patch, a pressure valve to stabilize the system while managers bought time for a longer solution. The lake kept dropping, so they escalated to Tier 2. More cuts. More pain distributed across states that had already absorbed the first round. Arizona lost more. Nevada lost more. Mexico lost more. Officials described the cuts as emergency measures. Temporary. Necessary but short-term. The language of crisis management designed to make the situation sound controlled. The lake kept dropping. Tier 3 followed. Even deeper cuts. Even more pressure on cities, farms, and communities that had already reduced their usage to levels that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. And still the intake tunnels crept closer to the dead pool threshold. The emergency measures that were supposed to buy time became permanent features of a system in slow collapse. Water rationing so normalized that nobody calls it an emergency anymore. The Bureau of Reclamation began considering proposals that reveal just how desperate the situation has become. One idea: drain both Lake Mead and Lake Powell simultaneously. Let the Colorado River run wild and unmanaged through the Grand Canyon again. Trust that engineering or optimism, or some combination of political willpower and infrastructure investments, will somehow ensure the lower basin states still receive the water they are legally entitled to. Scientists have described this publicly as removing the floor from a life raft and assuming everyone still floats. Another proposal: physically relocate Glen Canyon Dam's intake tunnels to lower elevations so power generation could continue, even if the lake drops below dead pool. The problem is straightforward and brutal. Engineering costs double and triple. With every foot lower the tunnels must go. Moving concrete does not create water. Rerouting pipes does not make the river run fuller. These are the structural equivalent of rearranging deck chairs. They signal action without addressing anything fundamental. The fundamental problem has one sentence: the river does not have enough water. There is no engineering solution for that sentence. The megadrought is not ending. Climate projections published in peer-reviewed journals show river flows could fall another 10 to 35% by 2050. The Southwest is heating at almost twice the global average rate. More heat, more evaporation, less water in the reservoirs. That physics is not solvable with concrete. You cannot negotiate with thermodynamics. The river goes where the water is, and the water is simply not where we need it to be anymore. The hard part is no longer understanding the problem. Every water manager from Phoenix to San Diego understands it. Every engineer who has worked on the Colorado River system understands it. Every scientist who has published a peer-reviewed paper on the topic in the last 15 years understands it. The hard part is confronting what the problem actually means for 40 million people whose entire lives are built on a foundation that was always going to give way. Las Vegas was built on the promise of Lake Mead's water. Phoenix was built on the promise of the Colorado River. Scottsdale and Tucson were built on the same promise. The Central Valley of California, the agricultural engine that feeds a nation, was built on the promise of controlled irrigation from a river that could not sustain those promises when they were made and cannot sustain them now. Palm Springs resorts, golf courses spreading across the Arizona desert, entire suburbs carved out of land that receives less than 5 inches of rain per year. All of it was built on the mathematical impossibility of a compact signed in 1922 during the wettest decade in 500 years. For a century, that worked because the reservoir buffer absorbed the gap. Now the buffer is nearly gone. The 2026 deadline for renegotiating the Colorado River Compact's operating agreements is approaching faster than any of the 7 states is prepared to admit publicly. The states still have not agreed on what water cuts they will accept. The federal government is watching the negotiations and the lake levels simultaneously, waiting to see if the system can somehow stabilize before a reckoning it has no plan for. Behind closed doors, states are already preparing for what comes next. Nevada is investing in desalination infrastructure along the Colorado River. Colorado is pushing aggressive conservation targets and exploring alternative water sourcing. Arizona and California are quietly drafting contingency plans that their officials will not discuss publicly, because discussing them publicly would require acknowledging that the system is failing. And the lake keeps dropping. Managed scarcity is the phrase nobody wants to say out loud. It means cities will contract. It means farms will go dry. It means entire agricultural regions that have existed for generations may simply cease to function. It means the explosive growth that defined the American Southwest for a century will go into reverse. The question is not whether any of this happens. The science settled that question years ago. The only question left is how much longer the emergency measures can delay the moment when the Deadpool threshold stops being a number on a document and starts being the daily reality of 40 million lives. Glen Canyon Dam is not dying because of bad engineering. The engineers built it exactly as designed, and it performed exactly as specified. It is dying because the American West asked a river to do the impossible, sustain the abundance of the wettest century in 500 years, forever, inside a climate that is growing permanently drier. A 710-foot wall of concrete cannot hold back physics. The bathtub rings keep accumulating on the canyon walls. The intake tunnels keep creeping toward elevation 3,370 feet. The 2026 deadline keeps approaching. And 40 million people keep building their lives on a foundation that the data has been warning about for decades. The optimism of 1922 has long since dried up. What remains is the waterline, and the waterline is still dropping. This is not a story with a clean ending written yet. We are all going to live through whatever comes next.